Hey gang, welcome back. So, when you think about Gambit, I'm sure you just pictured the smooth-talking Cajun mutant, hurling explosive playing cards with a grin on his face. But in X-Men 97 Season 2, fans had watched something far more disturbing unwind. After dying during the Genosha massacre, Remy LeBeau was brought back from the dead by Apocalypse, not as a hero, but as his newest Horseman of Death. Yet as shocking as that resurrection was, it wasn't the first time Gambit had returned as something that was darker than his normal self. Years earlier in the comics, Remy willingly gambled his own humanity in the hope of saving mutantkind, just to become one of Apocalypse's most terrifying creatures. So today, I'll be discussing the infernal anatomy of Death Gambit.
Some things be deeper than skin.
What turned Gambit into Apocalypse's Horseman? After her No More Mutants line in House of M number 8, Scarlet Witch caused the M-Day event, which depowered most of the mutants. According to X-Men Volume 2, numbers 177 to 181, Apocalypse believed that the catastrophe signified that the race had become too weak, and the only ones worthy to survive were those who could protect themselves and others. Hence, when he resurfaced during the Blood of Apocalypse crossover, he recruited a new set of horsemen, including mutants who had lost their powers during M-Day, restoring several of them with celestial technology before making them his horsemen. Unlike his predecessors who seemed to have randomly been selected, Apocalypse went after recognizable names this time. To be more precise, in X-Men Volume 2, number 182, he recruited Gazer, Polaris, Sunfire, and Gambit as the Horsemen of War, Pestilence, Famine, and Death. Nevertheless, it was not his most close ally, Gambit, who had the most impact on the impending confrontation. Unlike others who seemingly had to be brainwashed or coerced into joining Apocalypse, Remy LeBeau had willingly gone to him. The reason for that was that the Cajun believed that the Horseman of Death was a serious threat to mutant civilization, and he wanted to help his people by being close to him. It goes without saying that Gambit didn't intend to serve as a puppet for Apocalypse's messianic crusade, and as such negotiated terms and conditions before pledging his loyalty to Apocalypse. As a result, Gambit and Apocalypse came to an agreement that would allow Remy to use his free will, making him far more valuable than his fellow horsemen. Nevertheless, as X-Men Volume 2 numbers 183 and 184 would demonstrate, the Cajun's free-minded will were not going to be his own for much longer, as Apocalypse seemed to know something that Gambit didn't. The battle for LeBeau's soul had already begun, threatening to consume his self-awareness. What did the Apocalypse transformation actually do to his body? Once Gambit accepted the offer created by Apocalypse, transformation began almost immediately. It's different from upgrades to his armor or control over mind because using the same advanced celestial technology, Apocalypse changed his body at the deepest level. In fact, it seems that everything Apocalypse did to create the perfect horseman was tailored to the specific needs of the mutant and was aimed to turn him into a real weapon. It's evident because, as the plot of X-Men Volume 2, number 183 and 184's story shows, his external appearance was significantly changed. First, his skin tone was darkened to almost black. Second, his hair turned white, and his eyes were given an unusual look. Third, the character's brown trench coat was replaced with a black one in the style of the other horsemen. Together, these changes actually made Gambit almost unrecognizable, which instantly differentiated him from the X-Man he had once been, and marked him as Apocalypse's Horseman of Death. Still, the fact that Apocalypse turned Gambit into a horseman implies much more severe changes than just upgrading his appearance. As the list of personal powers on the official Marvel website goes, the abilities of the character weren't replaced with new ones in the process of transformation. On the contrary, some of his mutant powers were tuned to the maximum, allowing Gambit to achieve greater effects. Rather than just giving Gambit an entirely new mutation, Apocalypse amplified the powers he already possessed. According to Marvel's official character breakdown, his kinetic energy abilities became far stronger, which allowed them to affect living matter in ways they never could before. In addition to the loss of his old appearance and the upgrade of his powers, Gambit's psyche was also affected. As the plot of X-Men Volume 2, number 184 and 185 stories demonstrate, Apocalypse gradually changed his personality to be more suitable for the role of horseman. These changes occurred to the core, which was revealed when the transformation had finished. In fact, Apocalypse's influence on Gambit made a significant change to the inside of the character, and the new horseman was much more fearsome than any other.
Some things, they be deeper than skin. Sleep.
What was Death Gambit's complete power toolkit? Although Death Gambit retained his flair and agility characteristic of Remy LeBeau, his powers took a more sinister turn. Not only could he annihilate his foes with his displays of throwing all manner of his cards, detonating them conveniently in the most opportune moments for him, but according to Marvel's power listing, his kinetic charge could take another sinister form. Death Gambit's blasts of energy can decay and penetrate his enemies' bodies. His usual barrage of cards no longer only produced an explosive impact when thrown, but could also create an area effect damage on a much larger scale than before. The card that previously engaged in dramatic flight before exploding could now take on a dozen enemies with it instead of only one. The upgrades Apocalypse made to Gambit's power set were not limited to making his throwing cards have a larger zone of effect. As per the summary of his power set used for the Death Incarnation, Gambit also gained the Toxic Transmutation mutation that allowed him to make the air around him poisonous. Further additions to his power set suggested that he could also contaminate the air within his adversary's lungs. His attacks became substantially more dangerous and hard to avoid, compared to a substantial arsenal of kinetic-based attacks he had at his disposal before receiving Apocalypse's gift. Death Gambit no longer had to attack his opponents one by one, using some of his most powerful techniques as the circumstances of his resurrection battle required. Upgrading his abilities to have a larger effect and being more dangerous was not all the changes that made Death Gambit substantially deadlier. He also became much harder to read in single combat. It was made possible by the power of trajectory manipulation, which allowed him to alter the card's flight paths mid-air. Not only could his opponents not evade his attacks, but they also had to guess his intentions with every move, which surely hampered their readiness to act. Gambit was a dangerous fighter even before possessing Apocalypse's powers, as his natural skills and power gave him substantial advantages over his adversaries. However, with the additions of this power set allowing him to manipulate the card's trajectories, Remy's manipulations made him even deadlier in direct fights. One significant upgrade Apocalypse provided to Death Gambit was a substantial resistance to telepathic probing and attempts to occupy his mind. Years later in X-Men Hellbound, Death Gambit demonstrated perhaps his most disturbing ability by spreading his corruption to other mutants, temporarily transforming allies such as Dazzler and Northstar into servants of death. Although this was first shown in Hellbound rather than Blood of Apocalypse, it represented the lingering corruption left behind by Apocalypse's transformation. Every power Apocalypse granted to him followed the same principle, as not a single one was intended to make Gambit stronger in a straightforward manner. On the contrary, every addition to his power set allowed him to further expand his existing capabilities or transform them into something much more sinister. Why did Death Gambit turn on Rogue? As we see in the story X-Men Volume 2 number 187, Gambit as Death has already lost all the people and a chance to live a normal life that once were so dear to him. His love, friends, and family, who all loved and supported Remy LeBeau in his previous life, were taken from him via Apocalypse's power. The only thing left was Gambit's love, Rogue, but even this thread in the tapestry of his past life wasn't strong enough to save him from losing himself entirely. Gambit didn't come to Rogue with the intention to persuade or convince her to join Apocalypse, as he most likely saw her as the last thread connecting him with his past self that needed to be cut. He came to Rogue intending to kill her, believing that destroying the last connection to his previous life was the only way to fully embrace the Death persona. Thus, Gambit's attempt to kill Rogue was the first act, showing that the new Death powers and dark powers within him were stronger and more dangerous than ever before. In addition, as we see from the narrative, Gambit had to be stopped from killing Rogue by the mutant Pulse, whose powers knocked down Gambit's powers. For Gambit, it was hard to realize that the last thread connecting him to his old life was too long to sever. Thus, it was the battle with Rogue that showed, in particular, how much Gambit had lost in becoming Death. It was this battle that marked his transformation, showing that he had indeed become not himself but the embodiment of Death. The tragedy wasn't that Gambit had stopped loving Rogue, it was that the Death persona saw that love was the final obstacle to complete control. By trying to kill the woman he loved the most, Gambit wasn't just destroying Rogue, he was trying to erase the last part of Remy LeBeau that still existed. How did Gambit resist Apocalypse from the inside? Unlike other Horsemen, Gambit retained more of his own personality beneath the Death persona. When the blood of Apocalypse began to emerge in X-Men Volume 2 number 184 through 187, it became clear that within the Masked Warrior, a certain Remy LeBeau struggled with his instincts. Specifically in the fight against Apocalypse, Death Gambit's personality clashed with the X-Men and the orders of the Marauding Lord. This, in comparison with the other Horsemen, Gambit was perhaps the furthest from being his master's true tool. The battle between Apocalypse and Remy LeBeau continued throughout Blood of Apocalypse's story arc, as the titular antagonist's actions mirrored the internal chaos that had occurred before. While obeying the orders of the Dark Lord as Death Gambit, Remy continued to resist the role that he had been forced into. Moreover, despite being under the power of his master, LeBeau had free choice, which he demonstrated several times, for which Rogue and the X-Men reminded Apocalypse. The ability to choose was the essence of human nature, and internal clashes between the Horseman of Death and Rogue were manifestations of it, which, according to the villain, Apocalypse wanted to destroy. Therefore, given the circumstances, it becomes entirely clear why Death Gambit was never simply Apocalypse's obedient servant. In contrast to his comrade Horseman, who fought with a sense of dedication and loyalty, Gambit could not completely devote himself to Apocalypse as well as accept his orders and the path that the Dark Lord wanted to show the world. Although Mr. Sinister helped remove Apocalypse's influence, Gambit's experience as Death left later effects that would continue to follow him later on. Thus, the Leaping Larcenist was a corrupted hero in his own way, as his presence in the service of the Dark Lord was questionable. Just like the service of the other Horsemen, mutants that fought against Apocalypse and those who followed him were forced to consider the actions and motives of each of his subordinates, as they could all be false. The duel that unfolded between Gambit and Apocalypse for the right to be the Horseman of Death was not won by either of the two. After Apocalypse's defeat, Sunfire had helped Gambit to finally break free from the Horseman's remaining mental influence. However, that freedom was cut short, as Mr. Sinister soon approached Gambit and Sunfire with an offer to reverse their physical death transformations in exchange for joining his Marauders. Even though Apocalypse's control had ended, the scars of becoming Death continued to haunt Gambit thereafter. Thus, in the end, Apocalypse succeeded in creating Death Gambit physically, but he failed to completely erase Remy LeBeau's identity. While the manipulations of the Dark Lord and the Secret Master of the Horsemen did not allow Remy LeBeau to free himself from the duties that he didn't want to accept, the actions of Mr. Sinister once again showed that the manipulator was not as powerful as he thought. In fact, the would-be tyrant of Egypt was unable to make Gambit completely obedient to his will, and the Larcenist, despite being his apprentice, never fully surrendered to the role, as he was able to resist his master on at least a small scale for a short period of time. Essentially, even after Apocalypse's control had ended, Gambit's experience as Death continued to shape his life, and Mr. Sinister exploited that vulnerability for his own means. What was Death Gambit's greatest feat? Years after becoming Apocalypse's Horseman, Death made his appearance in X-Men Hellbound in 2010. Unlike the first instance when Gambit served as Death for Apocalypse, there was no master this time. It manifested itself first when the character, along with the other X-Men, Cannonball, Dazzler, Northstar, Anal, Pixie, and Trance, entered Limbo to rescue Ilyana Rasputin from demons. The manifestation of Death was much more terrifying than when he was under Apocalypse's control, because this time the corruption didn't leave Gambit after Apocalypse's death. It came out and showed itself in issue 2 of X-Men Hellbound, while the miniseries wanted to demonstrate that the corruption making Gambit Apocalypse's Horseman wasn't entirely gone after the villain's death. It manifested itself several times, and it was especially menacing when Death Gambit turned his allies into his servants, using the same corruption that made him Apocalypse's Horseman. Perhaps the most amazing display of Death Gambit's power was the fact that he could corrupt even his allies during the battle in Limbo. When he fought with Cannonball, Death turned all his other allies, Dazzler and Northstar, into his servants and transformed them into the Horseman of Death. Such a powerful ability to corrupt others, including friends and X-Men members, was the reason why Death Gambit was dangerous not only for Apocalypse and his minions, but for everyone in general. The miniseries X-Men Hellbound was the most remarkable demonstration of Death Gambit's power because of the exhibition of many and various abilities. However, the most frightening part was that he was able to corrupt his allies and transform them into Horsemen of Death. How did Gambit reclaim control during Hellbound? Death Gambit makes his return in X-Men Hellbound number 2 and 3. Similar to the Blood of Apocalypse story arc, the conflict takes a personal turn at its climax, as Gambit once again is forced to face the dark part of him that manifested when he fought Apocalypse, and as the events at Hellbound show, not wholly defeated. Unlike most of the powerful foes that the X-Men are pitted against in various stories, the Death Gambit is a person, albeit a corrupted one, as the Horseman persona threatens to consume his body and personality completely. Despite Northstar and Dazzler being transformed into new servants of Death, they're also the targets of X-Men's efforts, as Gambit himself is their true objective. The reason for this is that his inner struggle is what allows Gambit to overcome the Horseman, as the corruption that twisted him into Death Gambit in the past has not been fully removed from him. as events in Hellbound demonstrate, leaving Remy to fight himself yet again. This makes Gambit's victory over himself in Hellbound an appropriate conclusion to his prolonged conflict with Apocalypse that first twisted his soul, as demonstrated in X-Men Volume 2, number 184 through 187. Just as Gambit resisted Apocalypse's control during the Blood of Apocalypse storyline, he once again had to fight the corruption within himself in Hellbound. Yet, whereas the fight against Apocalypse, Gambit was able to overcome an evil force that threatened to destroy his life, in Hellbound he's victorious over a part of himself he can't wholly rid himself of, which implies that despite winning the fight, he'll still be consumed by the darkness within him at some point in the future. Gambit's deeds in X-Men Hellbound number 2 and 3 demonstrate that his greatest strength is his ability to overcome the darkness within himself and maintain his inner light, even if only partially, as his victory over the Horseman is only temporary. In Hellbound, just as in the Blood of Apocalypse, Gambit is unable to wholly purge himself of the corruption, instead retaining it within him, ready to consume him from the inside at the most unexpected moment. Despite the victory, there's a palpable sense of doom as the dark part of Gambit's soul that defines him as Death Gambit remains within him. Is Death Gambit ever truly purged? After being freed from Apocalypse's control in X-Men Volume 2, number 187, Gambit seemed to have left death behind once and for all. But, as would come to light in due time, Mr. Sinister's interference only managed to remove the external force compelling Gambit to serve as Apocalypse's Horseman. The inner counterpart, the corruption-induced drive, remained lurking within him, waiting for the right time to resurface. It took another decade, nearly 10 years, for the X-Men to understand what it was that made Gambit Gambit in X-Men Hellbound numbers 1 through 3, long after the events of Blood of Apocalypse. It manifested in the form of Limbo, where the X-Men had to enter in order to rescue Ilya Rasputin. But the reason why is important and twofold. Firstly, because it showed that Apocalypse's control over Gambit never truly disappeared, and secondly, because it didn't. While Gambit was eventually able to regain control over himself, the incident proved that death had not been completely removed. The very core of what made Gambit tick, his corrupted mind and body, remained as a horrible reminder of the time when he served as the Horseman of Death. That's why, even after Apocalypse was stopped, Remy remained hated and feared deep down inside. The part of him that was once his greatest weapon was still there, binding him to his dark legacy. And so, one of the darkest aspects of Gambit's character, the toxic result of his inner demons fueling his actions, defines him to this day in the comics. For a character so often portrayed as a villain, Gambit has seen remarkably little lasting negative change to his core personality. That's why the inner conflict fueling his violent nature, seen in his unwillingness to leave behind his violent and criminal past, is so telling of his true nature. While at the end of the day Apocalypse didn't truly break him, it became apparent that the existence left a rather ugly mark on him, namely the toxic part of his personality, the Horseman's curse that haunts him to this very day. Could Death Gambit have become even more powerful? Would Apocalypse made Gambit the Horseman of Death? He gave him one of the most powerful displays of his power. But few people seem to realize that Gambit in the Pages of Death was not empowered to his absolute maximum by Apocalypse, as his mutant powers had been artificially reduced for almost his entire existence prior to his death and subsequent transformation into the Horseman. The reason for this was because Mr. Sinister had altered Gambit's powers and placed a number of restrictions upon his kinetic mutant abilities, which significantly reduced his power level. Apocalypse's transformation amplified Gambit's existing abilities, but it certainly did not remove every limitation placed on his powers. It's important to note that Apocalypse did not overwrite Gambit's power potential with a new power potential, but rather augmented and corrupted his existing power, and the power that the Horseman of Death displayed was no more than his true power potential, exponentially increased by Apocalypse's interference. And so while the power that Apocalypse forced Gambit to use was tremendously powerful, it was no more than a slightly increased, lesser display of the Cajun's true power. The later story arcs, which depicted Gambit overcoming the limits that had been placed on him by Mr. Sinister, and subsequently restoring his mutant power potential to what it was before his encounter with the geneticist, significantly changed views on Gambit's mutant power potential, as his true power level was far greater than previously thought. And so in later story arcs, Gambit was regarded as an Omega-level mutant, but in the Era of Death series, he was not. In fact, it could be argued that the creation of the Horseman of Death was one of the most interesting what-if scenarios in the entire X-Men mythos. As Apocalypse made Gambit the Horseman of Death, and the Horseman of Death corrupted dozens of other mutants, it could be assumed that Apocalypse didn't utilize Gambit's true power potential when he turned him into the Horseman. As if he had accessed Gambit's true potential of power when he turned him into the Horseman, the result would have been far more dangerous than the Horseman version that was seen in the comics, because Gambit's power had been artificially repressed by Mr. Sinister before his encounter with Apocalypse. The Horseman of Death may not have represented the absolute peak of Remy LeBeau's potential, despite the fact that it was one of the most strong versions of the character that we've ever seen. An unrestrained burst of power from Gambit's natural power combined with the power from the corruption of the Horseman would have made Death Gambit far more fearsome than he'd been depicted to be in the pages of Death. How does X-Men 97 adapt Death Gambit? The Death Gambit in X-Men 97 Season 2 is an adaptation of one of the most popular storylines, but with one crucial difference, making it one of the best adaptations in my opinion. Unlike in the comics, Gambit is not willing to join Apocalypse as a Horseman of Death, but becomes his subordinate unwillingly, being resurrected with his new body by Apocalypse. The main difference between the two stories is that in the comic, Gambit is the one who sees the benefit in joining Apocalypse, while in X-Men 97 Season 2 Episode 6, Danger.exe, Gambit barely understands the circumstances under which he becomes Horseman of Death, as he wasn't expecting such an outcome and didn't want it to happen. Therefore, while in both versions Gambit becomes Apocalypse's Horseman of Death, in the animated series he does so without consent or free will, not perceiving what's happening around him. Importantly, the later episodes build on that tragedy instead of undoing it. In Episode 7, Gambit continues to serve Apocalypse as Death, under the weight of that forced resurrection. By Episode 8, Dead Man's Hand, we finally see Apocalypse's consciousness fully exposed inside Gambit's mind, forcing Professor X and Rogue into a psychic battle for Remy's soul. Rogue ultimately reaches him and pulls Gambit back from Apocalypse's control, echoing in the comics where he never becomes a simple puppet and always resists from within. I think that the adaptation made a better storyline because it made the character of Gambit more tragic, as compared to the comic version where he has a purpose in wanting to be the Horseman of Death and sees advantages in it for his survival, while in the animated series he doesn't have these advantages and unintentionally becomes an instrument for Apocalypse to kill most mutants. Another difference between the two storylines is that Gambit's beloved throwing cards are substituted with tarot cards, which seems to me an insignificant difference to note, but the reason for it can be that the cards symbolize that their owner's not in full control of his actions, as he can't predict what will happen next. Instead of being a second chance at life, Gambit's resurrection becomes another step in Apocalypse's plan to reshape mutantkind according to his belief that only the strongest should survive. Even though the comic and the animated series differ in many details of the storylines, X-Men 97 remain true to the original idea in the way it shows Gambit's inner struggle in both versions. While in the comic, Gambit struggles with the fact that Apocalypse's influence is slowly taking control of his mind and identity, in the animated series he struggles with the reality that his resurrected body has been turned into a weapon against his own people, and then with the horror of having Apocalypse living inside his mind. In both versions of the story, Gambit struggles to hold on to his own identity, while Apocalypse's influence tries to turn him into the perfect Horseman of Death. Although he serves Apocalypse for a time, Remy continues fighting against that control from within. And in X-Men 97 Season 2 Episode 8, that resistance finally pays off when Rogue helps him reclaim himself. Therefore, while X-Men 97 made significant changes to the storyline of Gambit and Apocalypse, it remained faithful to the original idea of showing the character of Gambit as a person who struggles with the loss of control and free will he always has as a part of his personality. Unlike in the comic, Gambit was not determined in the outcome of events in the animated series, which made the adaptation more tragic and less optimistic than the original storyline. In the comic, Gambit struggles against Apocalypse's corruption, slowly consuming his mind, while in the animated series he fights to regain control of the body Apocalypse resurrected and turned into a weapon, and later to expel Apocalypse's presence from his mind. Thus, Death Gambit in X-Men 97 Season 2 changes the canon storyline to show the loss and partial recovery of free will, which is slightly more pessimistic than the original, but is a great demonstration of the value of free will in my opinion. Death Gambit was never a villain driven by ambition. He was a hero who had gambled his own free will, believing he could control Apocalypse's power before it consumed him. Instead, that decision nearly made him kill the person he loved, turn his allies into enemies, and also revealed the terrifying possibility of a hero who was still Remy LeBeau while committing unimaginable acts. Across both the comics and X-Men 97, Apocalypse has changed Gambit's body, but never completely erased who he truly is. But the real horror of Death Gambit was never his power. It was actually the part of Remy that had managed to survive. So, did Gambit ever truly escape death? And whose underrated anatomy should we discuss next? Let us know down in the comments. If you liked this video, please hit like, subscribe to our channel, and make sure to ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on another marvelous video. Stay safe, have a great day, and as always, stay marvelous.